They called her Florence. Not her first name, though they didn't know it yet. Just Florence, like that was enough to summarize everything she wasn't. Brooke Sullivan had arrived at Seattle General on a Tuesday morning in late September, scrubs crisp from a department store tag, references carefully scrubbed of any detail that might raise questions. 8 years disappeared from her resume between the blank line and the reason for leaving her previous position. The application simply said she'd chosen civilian nursing because she wanted stability. Wanted to stop moving. Wanted normal. All of it was technically true, just carefully edited the way you edit classified photos, keeping the essential shape while removing anything that identified the location. The 7th floor of Seattle General in Colorado Springs smelled like industrial antiseptic cut with the faint sweetness of wound dressing paste and something underneath it all that never quite left any hospital, the mineral smell of fear. Brooke noticed these things the way other people noticed weather. Her nose catalogued the room before her eyes registered the layout. 2 acute care units branching left and right from the central nursing station. 12 patient rooms visible from the main desk. 2 exits, neither blocked. Emergency crash cart positioned 4.3 meters from the cardiovascular unit. Blood pressure monitors with cuff hoses coiled like snakes. She had calculated these distances before the nursing director finished saying welcome. The staff on 7 North didn't quite know what to do with her. She didn't talk much, not hostile, just economical with words, the way someone talks who understands that sound carries differently in enclosed spaces. She moved through the unit with no wasted motion, her hand steady and sure when she started fours, her voice low and even when she spoke to patients. Most new nurses came in trying to prove something, eager and nervous and hungry for approval. Brooke Sullivan came in like she was trying to disappear. Dr. Marcus Blackwell noticed her on the second day. He was examining a post-op cardiac patient in room 7 to 308 when Brooke came in to run the noon vitals. The patient's heart rate was climbing, 92, then 96, the monitor's rhythm just slightly irregular in a way that meant something was wrong but not obviously wrong. Blackwell was talking, the way he always talked, about the precision of his surgical approach and the superiority of his closure technique, his hands gesturing grandly while the patient's oxygen saturation crept downward. Brooke didn't interrupt. She simply positioned herself between the monitor and Blackwell's line of sight, noted the pressure starting to build in the left side of the patient's chest, and moved with the kind of quiet purpose that made people step out of her way without knowing they'd done it. In 6 movements, no hesitation between them, no checking her own work, she had the patient's oxygen adjusted upward, the position changed to elevate the left side, a saline bolus running, and Blackwell's hand gently moved aside so she could assess the dressing without tearing it. The patient's monitor settled. Heart rate dropped to 84. O2 sat rose from 88 back to 93. Done. She didn't look at Blackwell. Just checked the 4 rate, made a note, and left. He stood there for 17 seconds after she walked out, staring at the empty space where she'd been, his hand still raised in the gesture he'd been making when she'd moved him. His jaw was clenched in a way that made the muscles on either side of his neck stand out like cables. That was when the nickname started. Florence Nightingale without the lamp, he said to 2 third-year residents the next morning in the hallway outside the nursing station, loud enough that the entire unit could hear. Our mysterious new nurse, so quiet you can barely remember what she looks like. Very Victorian. Very tragic. I'm sure she's very devoted to her little patients. The residents laughed. It was that specific kind of laugh that said they were laughing because he was Dr. Blackwell, 3rd-generation physician, heir to the Blackwell surgical legacy, grandson of Dr. Richard Blackwell who'd been department chair in 1987, son of Dr. Thomas Blackwell who'd pioneered 3 cardiac procedures and had a wing of the hospital named after him. When someone like that made a joke about a new nurse, you laughed because the social equation demanded it. You laughed because saying nothing was a kind of answer too. By the end of the week, she was Florence on the 7th floor. The nurses called her that when they thought she couldn't hear, which she could always hear. She heard everything, the particular pitch of gossip versus genuine concern, the difference between a laugh that came from actual humor and a laugh that came from the hunger to belong to the right group. She heard Blackwell say her name like it was a punchline, watched him tell the story of how she'd reorganized his patient's care as if she was a well-meaning volunteer who'd overstepped, not a trained operator who'd probably saved that man from myocardial infarction. She continued her work. Brooke's hands moved through her shifts with the same economy they'd learned in the Hindu Kush, where every motion was calculated to preserve energy and supplies, where you learned that hesitation was a luxury only people with margin could afford. She checked the medications, accounting twice, comparing to the orders written by doctors who sometimes looked at patients and sometimes looked at their phones. She changed dressings with hands steady enough that post-op patients commented on how gentle she was, never knowing that gentleness and precision came from the same place, from having done this before under conditions where a tremor would have been fatal. She calculated fluid balance sheets and triage priority and which patients would crash and when, the way you calculated anything else that mattered, carefully and with all your attention. The only thing she kept that was personal was the jacket hanging in her assigned locker on the 7th floor. It was old, dark green canvas with reinforced stitching, the kind of jacket that had been expensive once and then got used in places where expensive didn't matter. Inside the left lining, the stitches barely visible and the thread color matched so carefully that you'd have to be looking specifically, was a patch. Faded. Once bright colors reduced to pastels by sun and salt and sweat. A unit patch. The kind of thing you kept sewn into a jacket because you understood that tattoos and photographs and medals were too obvious. The jacket was nothing special, just an old piece of outerwear that any nurse might wear on a cold morning walking to her car. But inside, in the dark, was the thing she'd been before she was Florence. A senior chief petty officer doesn't advertise. Dr. Blackwell noticed the jacket before he noticed anything else about her personal items. It was the second Friday, and Brooke had hung it on the back of her locker door while she was doing inventory, a mundane administrative task that required her to spend 2 hours in the supply room counting bandages and saline solutions and the small plastic tubes of lubricant that made every procedure run smoother. The jacket was visible from the hallway. Faded. Worn. The kind of thing that didn't fit the narrative he was constructing. "Where'd you pick that up?" he asked, coming around the corner of the supply closet with a confidence that said he'd calculated she was alone there. "Army surplus? Or did someone give it to you?" Brooke didn't stop counting. "My apologies, Doctor. I'm almost finished with the inventory." The formality of her response, the careful deferential tone, seemed to relax something in him. This was what he'd been looking for. This was the confirmation that the nickname was working, that she was absorbing the pressure and adapting to it the way prey animals did. She wasn't going to fight back. She was going to retreat into politeness and apologizing for taking up space. "Just curious," he said, picking up the jacket and turning it over like he was examining a lab specimen. "It's very tactical looking. Were you military or something? Let me guess. Army nurse, maybe? Some reserve component to you did before you decided actual nursing was easier." Brooke's hands didn't pause. She finished marking the count on the inventory sheet, 314 units of 4x4 gauze, verified, before she answered. When she did, her voice was the same even tone it always was. Not defensive. Not anything. Just words. "Civilian nursing is different work, Doctor." He dropped the jacket back on the locker door, and the gesture was dismissive in a way that said he'd made his point. Whatever that point was. She was someone who tried something and failed at something and was now doing the easier version. The jacket was a relic from a phase she'd moved past. A nothing thing from a nothing time. "Of course it is," he said, and walked away. Brooke finished the inventory and hung the jacket back up, arranging it so the patch inside wouldn't shift. The seam was still perfect. Invisible unless you knew to look for it. She'd sewn it herself 3 nights before arriving at Seattle General, working under a bare bulb in a rental apartment that smelled like someone else's cooking, her fingers steady as they'd always been. The patch had been with her through 8 years and 3 continents and every impossible thing that came with that. It would stay with her now too. Just hidden. Just waiting. Just something that no one needed to know about because she'd made a specific choice when she filled out the application form. She had chosen to be Florence, the quiet nurse with no history and no medals and no call sign. She had chosen to put down the weight of everything she'd been and try something else. The nickname didn't hurt because she'd been prepared for it. Names were tools. Nicknames were ways of controlling people, of putting them in boxes that were easier to understand and dismiss. If they called her Florence, they weren't thinking about what else she might be. And that was fine. That was actually perfect. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was what would happen when the silence broke. When the pretense finally cracked and the faded unit patch got brought into the light. She had no way of knowing that Dr. Blackwell's campaign of mockery was only the first phase of something much more deliberate. That by accepting the nickname, by absorbing the pressure without flinching, she was doing exactly what he wanted her to do. She was preparing him for the next stage. The room went quiet when Dr. Blackwell made his first phone call that Friday afternoon, closing his office door behind him and letting his expression shift into something that looked like satisfaction. He had 2 years of seniority over her. He had a family name that meant something in hospital circles. He had connections that went deeper than her quiet competence could ever reach. All she had was a faded patch and the muscle memory of doing impossible things. The game was just beginning. Pick that up, sweetheart, it's good practice for where you belong. That's what Dr. Marcus Blackwell said in the cafeteria at Seattle General, his voice carrying across 40 tables like a sermon of contempt. He didn't know the woman kneeling to gather scattered charts had held field hospitals under Taliban fire for 16 hours. He didn't know her hands had sutured wounds by flashlight while mortar rounds shook the walls. He didn't know that the faded patch sewn inside her jacket lining represented 17 years of service that no civilian credential could ever erase. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It changed everything. The rumors had started quietly, the way Dr. Blackwell did all of his work methodically, without hurry, like a surgeon planning incisions. He sat in the nursing director's office on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice measured and concerned. "I hate to bring this up," he said, which always meant he didn't hate it at all. But Seattle General should know about her previous termination. Patient endangerment. Very serious situation at her last hospital. I only mention it because we have a duty of care. The nursing director, Margaret Chen, 40 years in healthcare, sharp as a scalpel, had believed him. Why wouldn't she? Blackwell was a third-generation physician, his family's name on a pediatric wing, his credibility unquestioned. He had no reason to lie. She didn't know that he'd spent the previous evening on the phone with a contact at Seattle General's sister hospital, carefully planting the seed, then carefully denying he'd done it. "I certainly didn't say that," he told Margaret. "I would never speak about another nurse's employment record. But if you check, you'll find what you find." She had checked. The record was clean. Brooke Sullivan's last position had ended in an honorable exit, no flags, no complaints. But the seed had taken root anyway. Margaret began scrutinizing Brooke's scheduling requests, denying them without explanation. The night shifts multiplied. The weekend doubles stacked up. By the third week, Brooke was working 60-hour stretches with no clear reason why. During rounds on a Wednesday morning, Dr. Blackwell made his move again. They were standing beside a patient's bed, Mrs. Hernandez, 84 years old, recovering from a hip replacement. Brooke had just checked her dressing, noting proper granulation tissue, no signs of infection. "The incision looks clean," she said quietly. "Pain is controlled. I'd recommend advancing to regular bandaging tomorrow." Dr. Blackwell smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd already decided where the conversation would go. "Are you sure that's protocol, Florence? Or are you improvising again?" His voice had that particular quality, not loud, not aggressive, just loud enough that the patient heard it. The family members visiting in the next bed heard it. The other nurses clustered at the medication cart heard it. She felt the weight of their attention like pressure on her chest. Her jaw tightened once, then released. "It's Brooke, doctor. And yes, that's protocol. Standard advancement for clean incisions at day 5 post-op." "Of course it is." He turned away, his smile intact. She stood there for exactly 2 seconds before moving to the next patient, her hand steady despite the tremor of something that wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind that comes from having already survived worse. The bet came 2 weeks later, announced in the cafeteria during the shift change rush when maximum staff could hear it. Dr. Blackwell stood with 2 residents, Morrison and Chen, both ambitious, both eager to laugh at the right moments. His voice carried across the tables, casual and conversational, the tone of a man discussing fantasy football. $20 says Florence quits within a week, he announced. She doesn't have the spine for real medicine. One more shift of the way things actually work and she'll be back to whatever she was doing before. The laughter started immediately. Not cruel laughter, just the automatic response to a senior doctor's observation. Brooke was passing his table when she heard it, her tray balanced on one hand, turkey sandwich, side salad, coffee in a paper cup. She didn't slow. Didn't look. Just kept walking, eyes fixed on the empty seat she'd claimed in the corner 3 weeks ago. But Blackwell wasn't finished. He stepped into her path. It wasn't a collision. It was deliberate. His body positioned at an angle, his shoulder brushing hers, her tray tipping. The coffee cup first, spinning as it fell. Then the plate. Then the sandwich. Everything hit the tile floor in a cascade, the sound of breaking ceramic, the splash of liquid spreading across white tile in a perfect brown circle, the scatter of silverware like gunshot echoes in the sudden quiet. Oh, Florence! How clumsy! She knelt immediately, without a word, without anger. Just knelt and began gathering the pieces. Her hands moved with the kind of automatic precision that came from practice. How many field hospitals had she cleaned? How many times had she worked on blood-stained concrete while rounds whistled past? She reached for the plate, still intact, still warm. That's when Blackwell tossed the charts. They came down like snow, loose papers floating, landing on the tile around her kneeling form. Patient records scattered across the floor. Her name on none of them. Just charts, vital signs, medication logs, physician notes, falling around her like some kind of institutional rain. He smiled down at her, his voice sweet as a surgical blade. Pick that up, sweetheart, it's good practice for where you belong. The cafeteria held its breath. 40 nurses, 15 residents, a handful of attending physicians, all of them watching to see what Florence did. All of them waiting for her to either cry or leave or do something that would prove Blackwell right. She looked up at him. She gathered the charts. And as she did, one tear escaped, just one, a single breach of her composure, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Her voice was quiet. Barely above a whisper. But the room was so silent you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I've been on my knees in worse places than this, doctor, and still stood up afterward. 3 seconds of silence. Complete. Absolute. Then Morrison cleared his throat and someone laughed, a nervous sound, a breaking tension sound, and the moment passed like a cardiac rhythm returning to normal. Blackwell's smile never wavered, but his jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second. Just enough. He turned away. He didn't make eye contact for the rest of the day. But that night, in his office with the door closed, he made 3 phone calls. The first was to Richard Stratton, a medical board liaison he'd mentored 5 years ago. I need documentation, he said quietly. Unofficial, for now. A nurse who's showing signs of medication diversion. Not formal yet, just paperwork. Yes, it's serious. No, I can't explain more than that. Yes, I know the implications. I need it filed by Friday. The second call was to Thomas Kirkwood in risk management, a man whose son had received a full tuition scholarship to Yale through Blackwell's family foundation. The nurse I mentioned last month, he said. Keep this quiet, but I need file access. I'm documenting a pattern. Yes, I understand HIPAA. I'm doing this correctly. No, I won't tell you why yet. But when the time comes, I need everything on record. The third call was to the Chief of Staff, whose golf game had been sponsored by the Blackwell Foundation for 7 consecutive years. "I wanted to give you a heads up," Blackwell said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "We may have a personnel issue developing. Nothing confirmed, but my family's recent donation, we still stand behind this institution. Regardless of circumstances. I just wanted you to know that whatever happens, we're still committed to the pediatric wing. Yes, I understand you're busy. I'll be in touch." He hung up the phone at 11:47 p.m. and pulled up the supply room inventory system. The one Brooke still had access to. He navigated to the chest tube kits, the decompression needles, the sterile field supplies. His fingers moved across the keyboard with surgical precision. New access codes. New restrictions. All tied to his authorization. All locked from anyone without his explicit override. By midnight, Brooke Sullivan could no longer access the equipment that kept people alive. By 2:47 a.m., that wouldn't matter. The call came through at exactly that moment, a highway pileup on 25 North, 3 vehicles, multiple trauma codes incoming. The ER erupted into that particular chaos that only emergency medicine creates. Sirens wailing outside like machines crying out. Monitors being wheeled into position. Lines being drawn on the floor with colored tape to mark trauma bay assignments. The smell of antiseptic and adrenaline mixing in the filtered air. Brooke was assigned the male trauma from the second vehicle, mid-30s, camping gear scattered across the gurney, vitals already unstable when they wheeled him in. She took the patient history from the paramedics in that rapid-fire information transfer that had become muscle memory, multi-trauma from impact, initial LOC of 30 seconds, regained consciousness in the ambulance, possible internal injuries, no major lacerations visible but significant blunt force trauma to the chest. She established peripheral lines, worked through the trauma protocol, her hands moving with the kind of efficiency that comes from having done this 1,000 times before, though not in any hospital she was willing to acknowledge. The monitors showed heart rate climbing. Oxygen saturation dropping. His breathing becoming increasingly labored, his lungs not filling properly with each intake. She was checking his breath sounds when she felt it, that absence on the right side where there should have been air moving. Diminished. Almost silent. The trachea slightly deviated. The jugular veins beginning to distend. Her brain assembled the diagnosis before she'd finished examining him, tension pneumothorax. Air trapped between the lung and chest wall, collapsing the lung, compressing the heart, killing him slowly with every breath he tried to take. "Doctor, he needs a chest tube now," she called across the ER. Her voice was steady. Professional. Urgent without panic. Dr. Blackwell glanced over from the trauma bay across the room where he was managing a more visible injury. He saw her. He heard her. He waved his hand once, dismissively. "I'll determine what he needs. Continue monitoring." She watched the oxygen saturation drop. 92%. 89. 85. The numbers descending like a countdown. Her voice rose. "Doctor, he's crashing. Tension pneumo." "I said I'll handle it," he snapped back, his attention returning to his own patient. But he wasn't handling anything. He was across the room. The chest tube kit was in the supply room. Her access codes no longer worked. She'd checked an hour ago on a different patient, tried to grab sterile for gauze and found the door locked to her credentials. Only Blackwell could override it. Only Blackwell had the codes. She looked at the patient. His lips were starting to turn blue. The jugular veins were fully distended now, prominent as cable beneath his skin. O2 sat at 82% and falling. She looked at his bedside table. His camping gear. An MRE packet, meal ready to eat, still in its original vacuum-sealed packaging. Sterile. Airtight. The exact properties you needed for a makeshift chest seal. The Hindu Kush flooded back. Not just memories, but muscle memory. The forward operating base at Sanjin Valley. The field hospital in the basement of a destroyed school. 16 hours under mortar fire, 3 surgeons down, supplies running out, and a young Marine with a sucking chest wound that needed a seal because the textbook protocols weren't available and the only rule was, keep them breathing. Her hands moved before her mind finished the decision. The ambulances arrived at 2:47 a.m. For vehicles. The dispatch radio crackled with overlapping voices, highway pile-up on I-25, northbound lanes, secondary collision near the monument exit. Brooke was restocking the trauma bay when the doors exploded inward and the first stretchers came through, a wave of wet pavement and diesel exhaust and the iron smell of blood. She moved into the controlled chaos without hesitation, hands steady as surgical lasers, reading vitals and injuries in the same breath the paramedics were still shouting them. 38-year-old male, vehicle 2, second impact. Chest trauma, abdominal contusion, responsive but shallow breathing. The paramedic was already turning to the next bed. Camping gear scattered everywhere, his equipment literally saved his life in the first rollover. Brooke caught the stretcher, registered the patient's pale face, the shallow rise and fall of his chest. His pupils dilated. Breathing was rapid, panicked, each intake a struggle. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're at Seattle General. I'm Brooke. We're going to stabilize you." Her voice dropped into the register that didn't belong to a civilian nurse, the one that came from holding dying soldiers in sandstorm dark and telling them in a tone like iron that they would survive. The patient's eyes locked on hers. Something in her presence translated as, "You are safe now." She ran the initial assessment, contusions on the right side, diminished breath sounds on the left, heart rate elevated to 142 and climbing. His oxygen saturation hovered at 89. Not critical yet. Not yet. But his eyes told her what his body hadn't finished announcing. Tension pneumothorax. The kind that kills in minutes once it turns acute. The kind that required immediate decompression or a body on ice by 3 a.m. She reached for the chest tube kit, muscle memory directing her hand before conscious thought could finish forming. The supply room was locked. Again. She pulled the cabinet door. Locked. The inventory codes on the wall had been changed 3 hours ago. Dr. Blackwell's handwriting in the margin, new protocols. RN access restricted pending credential review. The patient's oxygen saturation dropped. 87, 84. His breathing became more labored, ribs pulling inward with effort. The monitor showed his heart rate accelerating, 150 now, chasing a train that was already leaving the station. He had minutes. Maybe 3. She didn't waste time on the locked cabinet. She didn't call Blackwell. She turned to the patient's belongings, stacked on the gurney beside him, a canvas camping pack, water bottles, something wrapped in green fabric. MRE packets. Military meals ready to eat. The kind that came in thick vacuum-sealed packaging designed to protect contents in combat conditions, sealed so tightly it could hold pressure like a medical device. She tore one open. The plastic crackled like gunfire in the sudden silence of the trauma bay. A resident looked up. "What are you?" "Get me a 14-gauge needle and an alcohol swab. Now." The word now carried the weight of 8 years. The weight of 16 hours holding a field hospital under Taliban fire while 3 surgeons lay bleeding and a young Marine gasped with a sucking chest wound and the only rule in the Hindu Kush was keep them breathing. The resident didn't question. Didn't hesitate. That's what happened when command voice came from hands that knew how to work miracles in conditions where textbooks caught fire. She fashioned a seal from the MRE packaging, cutting it into a rectangle, wrapping it twice with medical tape to create an occlusive barrier. Improvised. Unconventional. Exactly what she'd done in a fire base 50 miles from the nearest hospital when the supply helicopters couldn't land and a 19-year-old from Nebraska couldn't afford to wait for protocol. The patient's oxygen saturation was 82 now. His breathing was a wheeze. The monitor showed the heart trying to compensate through sheer desperation, pushing harder, faster, dying. She palpated his chest wall, located the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Felt for the landmarks her hand remembered in the dark. The needle gleamed under the fluorescent lights. She swabbed the skin with alcohol, watched it dry. One controlled thrust. The needle went through skin and muscle and pleura. The sound that came next, the hiss of escaping air, like the world releasing a breath it had been holding, stopped the entire trauma bay. His body relaxed. The desperate gasping eased. The monitor's frantic rhythm began to settle. Oxygen saturation climbed, 85, 88, 91, 94. By the time she secured the needle with tape, his breathing had returned to something approaching normal. His eyes met hers again. "Thank you," they said. "You kept me alive." Across the trauma bay, Dr. Blackwell stood motionless. He was staring at the improvised seal, the MRE wrapper on the floor, the needle still producing the occasional whisper of escaping air. His expression was stone, the kind of stone that means a calculation is happening, an equation rebalancing, a decision being made in real time about how to respond to something that had just violated every hierarchy he'd constructed. He moved toward her in 4 strides, his pace deliberately unhurried. Controlled. "What the hell did you do?" She met his eyes. Her voice was calm. Flat. Professional. Needle decompression. He had tension pneumothorax. "I couldn't access the chest tube kit because you changed my inventory codes." The trauma bay had gone silent. The kind of silence that happens when people realize they've just witnessed someone cross a line that can't be uncrossed. The kind of silence where consequences are already calculating in the air like physics. Blackwell's jaw tightened. His hands clenched and unclenched. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered across his face. Not anger. Something worse. Recognition. He'd come here expecting to find her helpless, and instead he'd found her capable in a way that made his years of credentials feel paper-thin. "You performed an unauthorized procedure," he said quietly, "with non-sterile materials, without attending physician approval, on a patient under my supervision. He would have died. Step away from the patient." She did. She stepped back, her hands releasing the bedside rail, her position shifting from healer to accused. The patient watched her go, eyes widening with the sudden understanding that she was being separated from him, that the woman who'd just saved his life was being treated like a liability. Blackwell made the first phone call before the patient reached the ICU. She heard him in the hallway, voice measured and professional, speaking to the medical board liaison he'd mentored, unauthorized procedures, non-sterile technique, protocol violations, patient endangerment. The second call went to the risk management director who owed him favors. The third went to the chief of staff, and she heard Blackwell mention, very casually, the family foundation donation that had just been pledged, $200,000 for a new pediatric wing. By morning, his documentation was airtight. Gross violation of protocol. Unauthorized procedures. Dangerous improvisation. Her termination letter was waiting on the chief of staff's desk before her shift ended, and when she opened it, the language was formal and legal and built to withstand any argument. The risk management section mentioned that while the patient had stabilized, the procedure was outside standard of care and represented a threat to institutional liability. She didn't defend herself. Didn't mention the Hindu Kush. Didn't pull out her jacket and show them the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the patch that represented 16 years of saving lives in conditions that would make a civilian doctor's hand shake. She'd spent those years wanting to leave it behind, wanting to be just a nurse in a quiet hospital, wanting to exist in a world where competence came from credentials and not from watching people die. She handed in her badge. She picked up the box with her personal items. She walked out of Seattle General at 6:15 a.m. while the rain hammered the parking lot like applause for something nobody was celebrating. The phone calls began at 7 in the morning. Dr. Blackwell sat in his office with the door closed, fingers steepled on mahogany that cost more than most nurses made in a year, and dialed the first number from memory. The medical board liaison, a man he'd mentored through 2 malpractice suits and 1 very quiet divorce settlement, picked up on the second ring. "It's Blackwell. I'm documenting a serious protocol violation. Unauthorized procedure on a trauma patient." I'll need your office to flag her file before she tries to transfer elsewhere. No preamble. No explanation. Just the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The liaison stammered something about due process. Blackwell cut him off. You owe me, Richard. This is how you pay it back. He hung up before an answer came. The second call went to risk management. This director owed him favors that ran deeper, something about a surgical error that never quite made it to the state board because Blackwell's signature had disappeared from one very important incident report. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. Blackwell's voice remained level, measured, professional. I'm concerned about liability exposure. She performed a procedure without authorization, without appropriate equipment, without supervision. The patient could have deteriorated. We need to move quickly to protect the institution. The director's resistance crumbled within 30 seconds. I'll have termination paperwork drafted by 8. Perfect. The third call was the master stroke. The chief of staff picked up on the first ring, always did for Blackwell. They'd served on 3 committees together, and more importantly, Blackwell's family foundation had just pledged $200,000 toward a pediatric wing renovation. The chief was still basking in that announcement when Blackwell spoke. We have a serious situation. One of our nurses endangered a patient with reckless field medicine improvisation. I've documented everything thoroughly. I need your support on immediate termination to demonstrate the hospital's commitment to protocol. The chief of staff made a small noise of concern. Of course, Marcus. Whatever you need. The words came out like relief. This was easy. This was how power worked: accumulated favor, institutional leverage, the accumulated weight of 1,000 small debts collected and called due all at once. At 8:15 a.m., Brooke sat across from Dr. Blackwell in that same office with its mahogany desk and its view of Colorado Springs sprawling below like something he owned. His voice was calm, surgical, precise, the kind of measured tone used by men who'd never had to shout because the world had trained itself to listen. Your employment at Seattle General is terminated effective immediately for gross violation of hospital protocol and unauthorized procedures that endangered patient safety. He slid a termination letter across the desk. Every paragraph was legally impeccable. Every sentence had been reviewed by hospital counsel. Every word had been chosen to be unassailable in arbitration. He gestured at it with one finger, the gesture of someone pointing at evidence in a courtroom. You'll receive 2 weeks of severance provided you sign a non-disclosure agreement. Your credentials will not be challenged in any formal capacity. You simply won't work here anymore. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Brooke didn't cry. Didn't defend herself. Didn't mention the field hospital in Sanjin Valley, the one she'd held together with her hands and her voice and sheer will while mortars fell like rain. Didn't mention 47 wounded operators brought to her by dust-covered men with haunted eyes who whispered Valkyrie-like prayer. Didn't mention the 16-hour rotation where she'd performed emergency surgery by chemical light, where she'd talked a 19-year-old from Oklahoma through a femoral artery bleed while his blood soaked through 3 pairs of gloves, where she'd held the line because that's what you did when you were all that stood between broken people and death. She had genuinely wanted to leave that life behind, no uniform, no medals, no explanations. Just a nurse in civilian scrubs with a faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining where no one would ever see it. She picked up the pen. Signed the papers. Blackwell watched her with the satisfied expression of someone who'd orchestrated a small, perfect victory. He stood, extending his hand as if they were colleagues parting on good terms. Brooke didn't take it. She stood, picked up the termination letter, and walked out of his office. The nursing staff watched from the break room window as security escorted her to the employee exit. The same guard who'd smiled at her for 8 months wouldn't meet her eyes now. His jaw was clenched like he was swallowing something bitter. She carried the cardboard box with her personal items, a stethoscope, a photo of mountains she'd never taken, a coffee mug that said "Crazy Cat Lady" even though she didn't own cats, and walked out into the Colorado Springs morning while the rain hammered the parking lot like a standing ovation for something nobody celebrated. 3 days later, she sat in the waiting room of the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Colorado Springs, surrounded by young men with haunted eyes and thousand-yard stares. They were the ones she used to pull back from the edge. The ones whose hand she'd held while their monitors flatlined. The one she'd whispered to in that particular voice reserved for soldiers who'd seen too much. "It's okay, I've got you, I'm right here." Now she was one of them. Just another broken veteran who couldn't adjust, couldn't sleep, couldn't turn off the part of her brain that catalogued threats and exits and the weight of bodies she'd carried. The intake nurse had asked about previous occupation. Registered nurse, she'd written. The line before that, military service, she'd left blank like it was a secret even she wasn't allowed to know. The veterans around her shifted in their seats. One of them, a kid with a prosthetic left hand and a tattoo of a ranger's tab on his neck, he kept glancing at her. She recognized that look. He recognized her. Not her face, but something about the way she sat, the way her shoulders were set, the way her eyes tracked the doors and windows like she was mapping escape routes. She was about to stand and leave, about to walk out of this building the same way she'd walked out of Seattle General, when the waiting room doors exploded open. Not violently, but with the kind of force that made everyone stop breathing. Humps surrounded the main entrance of the VA hospital. Men in dress uniforms moved with the coordinated precision of operators. And Dr. Blackwell's carefully constructed world was about to collapse in the most public way possible. The glass doors exploded inward as four humps surrounded the building, their engines rumbling like thunder caught in a parking lot. A Special Forces colonel strode through the lobby in full combat uniform, boots striking tile with the precision of a metronome, his voice cutting through the hospital's ambient hum like a blade through silk. "Where is Senior Chief Sullivan?" Nurses froze at their stations. Orderlies stopped mid-stride. The question hung in the fluorescent-lit air, and in that suspended moment, everyone understood that someone in this building had been catastrophically underestimated. The trauma patient Brooke had saved, the man from the highway pileup whose collapsed lung she decompressed with field medicine and determination, staggered out of his room. His chest still bore the tape of her improvised seal, the MRE packaging that had brought him life when protocol couldn't. He looked directly at her standing frozen near the nurse's station, her name badge catching the overhead lights, and whispered a word that had been locked in classified briefings for 2 years. His call sign for her. The one she hadn't heard spoken aloud since leaving that life behind. The one that meant she wasn't just a nurse. She was the one who'd held the line when the line was collapsing. A Marine gunnery sergeant stepped forward, his dress uniform a landscape of ribbons and commendations. He opened a folder with the weight of official documentation, and his voice, steady as a sniper's breath, began reading her military citations aloud to the assembled hospital staff. Bronze Star for Valor under fire. Pause. Reaction rippled through the corridor. Nurses who'd ignored her now pressed closer. Silver Star for leadership during the Kandahar offensive. Another pause. Someone gasped. 2 Purple Hearts. His voice didn't change. He was simply stating fact, but each decoration was a hammer blow against the narrative Dr. Blackwell had constructed. And for holding Phi Base Argus under continuous Taliban assault for 16 hours while treating 43 wounded operators with 0 casualty support, while coordinating with air support and refusing evacuation despite 2 shrapnel wounds to her abdomen and 1 to her left shoulder, this hospital is informed that Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan received the Navy Cross. The room didn't just go silent. The silence became a presence. It had weight. It had physics. A general entered through the emergency bay doors. He didn't stride like the colonel had. He moved with the economical efficiency of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. When he saw Brooke, his posture shifted, not a salute exactly, but something older and more formal. His hand rose to his temple in the tradition reserved for classified operators, for personnel whose missions exist in redacted files, whose names are never spoken in official reports. The salute acknowledged not the woman, but the weight she carried, the things she'd done that would never appear in any hospital record or public documentation. He held that salute for 3 seconds. In a hospital hallway. In front of 200 staff members. The message was unmistakable: this woman was no one to underestimate. 2 Pentagon liaisons arrived within the hour, their credentials producing a visible shift in the Chief of Staff's posture from aggressive to compliant in 1.3 seconds. One of them, a woman with the bearing of someone who'd spent 15 years in the Judge Advocate General's office, stepped directly to Brooke and spoke a single word. Not her name. Her code name. The operational designation that existed only in classified files and in the memories of the people who'd served with her. Hearing it spoken aloud was like hearing a ghost speak your true name. The liaison handed her a folder. Inside were reinstatement papers, not from Seattle General's administrative office, but from the Secretary of Defense. Personally signed. The hospital would reinstate her immediately. Her previous termination was vacated. Her personnel file would be corrected. Any notation of the firing would be expunged. The medical board inquiry into Dr. Blackwell would proceed to full investigation, with the Secretary of Defense's personal recommendation for criminal referral. The same security guard who had walked Brooke out 6 weeks earlier with her belongings box approached Dr. Blackwell's office with an identical box. This time, it held his possessions. His voice was flat, satisfied, the audio equivalent of a final punctuation mark. "I believe you know the way out, sir." Blackwell stared at him, then at the box in his hands, then at the nurses watching from the break room window. His family's foundation donation had been accepted by the hospital board one final time, then the board had placed Dr. Blackwell on immediate administrative leave pending federal investigation. The medical board had suspended his license. 3 weeks later, his appeals were denied. Without his license, he couldn't practice medicine anywhere. Seattle General terminated his employment. Now he stood holding a cardboard box containing his stethoscope, his personal effects, the credentials that no longer meant anything. No one said goodbye. Security escorted him to the parking lot. His Ivy League diploma would eventually find its way to storage. 6 months later, a nurse named Carla passed a veterinary clinic on the east side of Colorado Springs and did a double take through the window. Dr. Marcus Blackwell sat behind a front desk, his plastic name tag reading simply Marcus, Receptionist. He was scheduling appointments for anxious golden retrievers, answering phone calls about flea medication and vaccination schedules, his voice stripped of all authority. He'd fallen from attending physician to animal clinic front desk in one career arc. His Ivy League credentials hung in a storage unit somewhere, gathering dust. The story spread through Seattle General like wildfire, and the nurses who'd once feared him now pitied him, which was infinitely worse. Meanwhile, Brooke Sullivan stood in the trauma bay wearing scrubs and her jacket, the faded unit patch still sewn inside the lining where no one would see it unless they knew to look. She didn't broadcast her identity. She didn't wear her medals or speak her rank. She simply existed in the space where medicine was needed most, where patients arrived broken and left with their lives intact. When she gave orders, people listened. When she moved, people got out of her way. The transformation was complete, not because anyone had told the story, but because now they understood what they were looking at. A medevac brought in casualties from a training accident at Fort Carson that first week. A 19-year-old Marine with a femoral artery laceration that was bleeding out faster than fluids could replace it. Brooke called for a Reboa balloon catheter, positioned the patient for controlled resuscitation, her hands moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd saved lives in worse conditions than this with worse equipment than this. Typo, 10 units, running wide open, she said to the nurse beside her. Not a request. A command. Get me a surgical tray. We're doing this in the bay. The patient's blood pressure climbed from 62/28 back to 94/56. Stabilized. The bleeding stopped. The surgeon arrived and simply watched her work, realizing halfway through that he was learning from her, that everything he'd learned in medical school was theory and she was teaching him practice. She saved him. She always saved them. The story had spread beyond Seattle General by then. 200 Special Forces operators across 3 states had heard what happened, how a nurse had been fired, how the Pentagon had arrived, how a code name had been spoken aloud in a hospital hallway. They made sure every military hospital, every VA clinic, every trauma center in the region knew the name. Senior Chief Sullivan. When the impossible walked through the door, the patient who shouldn't survive, the wound that couldn't be stabilized, the crisis that had no textbook solution, they knew who to call. The network of operators and military medics passed her name like a prayer, like a guarantee. If you need the best, they whispered, if you need someone who's done this before, who's held the line under fire, who doesn't panic when everything falls apart, you call Senior Chief Sullivan. She saved 4 lives that shift, then went home to her quiet apartment in the hills above Colorado Springs. The rotor wash from the medevac departure still echoed in her ears. She hung her jacket in a closet, the patch still hidden in the lining, and slept 6 hours without waking once. The next morning, a young Marine in the waiting room recognized her by something indefinable, the way she moved, the way she held authority without speaking, the weight of classified missions that clung to her like a cologne no one could name. He started to come to attention. Brooke shook her head gently, smiled, and spoke the words that had become her signature in this new life: power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. He relaxed. She went to work. And somewhere across town, Dr. Blackwell answered another phone call about a Pomeranian's vaccination schedule, his hand steady, his voice polite, his credentials expired, his future written in appointment books for animals instead of lives for people. If you've made it this far, you understand what happened here. A woman who'd been dismissed, underestimated, and destroyed through institutional cruelty was vindicated not by revenge but by revelation, the truth about who she actually was. Subscribe for more stories about the hidden strength in ordinary people, the ones doing extraordinary things in the quiet places no one's watching. Like this video, comment with your thoughts. Would you have called for the Pentagon, or would you have let her fade into obscurity? And if you know someone like Brooke, someone whose real value is invisible to the world, share this with them. They need to know someone remembers what they've sacrificed.